Stimson this morning to spend a little time with us on this little bit of an unusual topic, Eurasia strategy, American and Japanese perspectives. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tatsumi. I'm a director of the Japan program and a senior associate at Stimson. For the last couple of years, Canon Institute for Global Studies based in Tokyo and Stimson have begun the collaboration where we will co-host a public event once or twice a year to shoot for a rather unusual pattern of U.S. Japan. Kuni and I like to go unconventional, so we don't want the U.S. Japan conversation to focus just on bilateral issues or bases or U.S. Japan security cooperation or Japanese politics. Because our two leaders describes the U.S.-Japan relationship as more of a global partnership, we believe that it is really important that the conversation goes beyond the bilateral U.S.-Japan scheme and touches on the broader issues. And actually, it also gives me a great excuse to introduce to you a wonderful colleague that I have here at Stimson as well. So I greatly appreciate the opportunity that the CIGS has given us to do this. So today, like I said in the beginning, you will hear a little bit of a different tone of discussion. In the last 12 months or so, the concept of Eurasia has kind of come to the very forefront of the defense strategy discussion in terms of how Americans look at the world. And when you look at the maritime space, the way to describe the maritime space have also evolved from, we used to call it Asia Pacific, Indian Ocean, Gulf of Arabia, and then now it's more connected. It's Indo-Pacific and Gulf of Eden, or much larger. And Eurasia is kind of a competing a theoretical perspective to look at it on the landmass side of things that covers the vast area from Europe to East Asia. So how does and should we, as in the United States, should look at this broader region, and how Japanese look at this emerging strategic concept? This is what we're going to have a conversation on the next 90 minutes or so. Let me quickly introduce the wonderful set of speakers that I'm fortunate to have this morning. Immediately to my left is my wonderful colleague, Samir Lalwani. He's a senior associate and deputy director for South Asia program at Stimson. And he was, before coming to Stimson, he spent a lot of time at RAND Corporation. He was also a national security next generation leaders fellow at the Center for New American Security, and also participant in the CSIS Nuclear Scholar Initiative. To his left is my former boss, Laipson, distinguished fellow, and the president emeritus of the Stimson. Her core expertise in the Middle East space, but she has touched a broader issue of national security and intelligence. Her last job that she had in public service was the deputy chairman of the National Intelligence Council, the position she served between 1997 through 2002. Even after she left the government, she did served on a couple of the government advisory panel, including President Obama's Intelligence Advisory Board and Secretary of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. To her left is Kuni Miyake. I will call him my boss in Tokyo. He's a research director at the Canon Institute of Global Studies in charge of foreign affairs and national security issues. Prior to that, he's a retired diplomat. Also, his core strength started out as a Middle East, but since then he played the really essential role in the first round of the U.S.-Japan guideline revision as the director of the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty Division. That's where I first met him about 20 years ago. That reveals both of our age, so I will not further discuss that. But since then, he also has served in China as a Minister of Public Affairs. So he has had the wide range of position that allowed him to look at Middle East and the Asia at large. And to the far right, and not to the least, is Jimbo. He's a senior fellow at the CIGS, but that's a dual hat position. He spends most of his time at the Keio University as associate professor. He is one of Japan's leading expert on the Asia-Pacific security issues, that if something bad happens to him, Japan's intellectual property in that realm will be diminished by 50% probably. So we'll pray for his long life, long and healthy life. And without further ado, I'll just dive into the discussion. So what's going to happen is that I will pose the short question to each four participants. So we do that round about 2 or 3 times, depending on how the conversation flows amongst you all. And then toward the end, I will definitely open up the floor to the questions. So starting out, Eurasia covers a huge landmass, and we were just talking about how it comes back into vogue, as Ellen pointed out. And why should Americans care about this concept now as the strategic notion? I'll have you start, Ellen.
Well, thanks, Yuki, and it's a pleasure to be back with Kuni. When we were both in government, we had plenty of occasions to try to work together on U.S.-Japan cooperation in the Middle East. But I really love the broad topic that you've picked, Yuki, because I think it's important to step back from day-to-day policy issues sometimes and try to understand a little more conceptually how is the world changing. So I want to start with a little bit of a paradoxical thought, which is that, of course, geography matters. Geography matters more than ever in terms of how states and societies compete over natural resources and who's friendly and who's not friendly in neighborhoods around the globe. And the Eurasian landmass has always been a geographic truth that, and it happens in Russia, that Russia is both in Europe and in Asia. Turkey has the same identity issue, which is that it literally is the bridge where the landmass of Europe and the landmass of Asia begin. So it's an enduring reality that there's a place called Eurasia. As a practical matter, it's not been an organizing principle for the United States in recent years, but it's a very good question of should it come back into vogue and be a useful concept for us. So, geography matters, and then geography matters less in the age of globalization, okay? That we can find coalitions and alliances and partnerships that jump over geographic space as governments try to find opportunities to cooperate with like-minded countries. So I guess I want to start with that the Eurasian landmass maybe is almost too big to imagine it as a single zone of peace and security and cooperation. There's too much competition inside it, and that it's going to be a very natural phenomenon to break it into smaller pieces. But I think it's very useful to push us a bit as we think of the rise of Asia to make the connection between our enduring interests in Europe and our greater cultural familiarity and comfort in working transatlantic. How do we connect that to the rise of Asia and to America's engagement in Asia? So are there ways to make more real and bring together when we think of problem solving? Is there a way that you have the US, Europe, and Asia in the same room together? We have tended to segment it and say either it's transatlantic cooperation or it's our grand strategy towards Asia, and we know who the great Asian powers are, and Japan looms very large in that formulation. But should we, the US, and then let's take the US out of the equation. Is it happening spontaneously between Europeans and Asians to engage more directly, whether the US is the prime mover or not? So I think it's an intriguing question. I think that for policymakers, big bureaucracies break things into pieces, and the pieces are never perfect. So however you define the regions of the world, there's always going to be some problem that you're missing. So when the US government created the South Asia Bureau, it was considered a small and weak bureau compared to the larger bureau, so they added Central Asia to it. Well, Central Asia could just as logically have stayed connected to the bureau that covered Russia or the bureau that covered East Asia. So I guess a simple answer, if I just think in a very inside the beltway fashion, I don't think the U.S. system will embrace Eurasia as an organizing principle for the bureaucracy, but I think it's a broader concept that we need to keep in mind when we want to think about how to promote international cooperation, and in some cases how to reduce the burden on the United States to be the organizer of international responses to big problems.
And Samir, your core expertise in South Asia, but then you often talk a lot about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and how U.S. should actually think through these issues and also look at the Eurasia as the one strategic zone as we look at how we operate within there, particularly in the political military realm. So let me pose the same question to you.
Sure. Yeah. So I was brushing off my my old notes on grand strategy from years and years ago as I was trying to understand this concept. And Eurasia as a concept features very large in sort of debates on grand strategy. The United States has long been concerned about Eurasia, even if we don't sort of specify it in those terms, at least in the bureaucratic realm. But a lot of IR theorists would say that the United States has cared a great deal about Eurasia since the beginning of the Cold War, and the objective, and even prior to that, in World War II and prior to that, the objective was to prevent dominance of a single hegemon on sort of the more industrialized portions of Eurasia. So the objectives in World War II were to prevent sort of Germany's hegemonic rise and dominance of Europe, but also Eurasia, right? Because there was a pivot towards the West as well. The challenge to the Soviet Union was also based on sort of preventing this dominance of a single hegemon. And even though the United States economy was pretty independent to a degree, and its security has always been sort of guaranteed just by sort of our natural geography, there was a concern always that the event of a great power war and a hegemon in industrial Eurasia would pose a threat to either U.S. economic interests, both sort of directly and indirectly because of the consequence of a great power war. Modern weaponry in this day and age can have tremendous destructive power, and with greater integrated economic sort of engagements, that would come back to affect us, at least economically, if not militarily. So I think at a very high level, this has always been a concern for the United States. And I think it sort of shapes how we think about what our core equities are and what regions, even within Eurasia, matter most to us. So another question I think Yuki had posed earlier that we were talking about was, what are the regions within Eurasia that we care a great deal about? Well, industrial Europe was always sort of central to this. Industrial Northeast Asia was always central to this. And the Middle East, historically, even prior to the sort of the stand-up of CENTCOM, was always very important because of energy resources. As militaries and economies transitioned to dependent on an oil economy and hydrocarbon economy, this became central for U.S. security interests. So these were sort of the core of it. But gradually, as we've seen global supply chains sort of spread out beyond those sort of three epicenters of industrial or sort of the core economy of the United States, we've seen this sort of move into Southeast Asia, where there's a lot more sort of industry there, and global supply chains depend on Southeast Asia and South Asia as well, and Eastern Europe. So I think it's much broader in some ways. So a lot of places are critical, but there are different ways to ensure the security or stability of those areas. And I think oftentimes we tend to conflate ensuring stability and security with having to have a forward presence in all these places, and that may not necessarily be essential to have a Eurasia strategy. You asked about South Asia and its configuration within this, and sort of what are the challenges here with equities in Afghanistan and Pakistan and India. I think we're starting to see a lot of U.S. policymakers, but also policymakers within South Asia and East Asia, start to think about this relationship of the Indo-Pacific, so that the South Asia is deeply intertwined with Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, both economically, but also it's going to be strategically maritime sort of traffic that moves through the South China Sea then enters into the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is sort of like one of the central sort of places for a lot of maritime traffic, for a lot of hydrocarbon traffic. So they're interconnected economically, and then they're becoming interconnected because of that geopolitically in terms of great power competition within Eurasia. So India is a central part of U.S. strategy to create geopolitical pluralism in Eurasia, to balance maybe China and maybe some other rising or re-emerging powers. So it becomes sort of part of U.S. strategy. But at the same time, there are other sort of things that we're doing in the region that tend to sort of draw both attention, resources, and bureaucratic focus. So we also have close to 10,000 troops deployed in the middle of Central Asia, in Afghanistan. And that can, you can say at times that might be congruent with certain parts of Eurasian strategy. It could be in tension, though, in some ways. And I think one area where you're starting to see sort of this tension is, as Ellen pointed out, the bureaucracy is unable to sort of focus around sort of a larger unifying principle of the Indo-Pacific or Eurasia, in part because there are certain bureaucratic sort of departments within the State Department, the SRAP's office, or a section within OSD policy that has to focus specifically on this Afghanistan-Pakistan problem because of forces deployed in the region. And so that then maybe limits their ability to sort of engage with the broader sort of regional conceptualization of South Asia and the interconnectedness and spillover effects of policy decisions, and then in turn sort of building that strategy in tandem with U.S. strategy in East Asia as well.
Thank you. Kuni, why should Japan care about Eurasia?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank Stimson Center for making this happen, because I never wanted to do anything by the Japan-US people, for the Japan-US people. There are so many occasions like that, but I just want to be more global. So I do not represent any government in this place. I always want to share with you some of my thoughts about my sort of Kuni Miyake School of Global Geopolitical Studies. I see, and I know how important concept of Eurasia for Japan. Well, those days are gone when Japan just think about East Asia and just think about U.S.-Japan security alliance. Those days are gone, I think. And when I see the Eurasian continent, it's my thinking. I see three theaters, basically. European theater, Middle Eastern theater, and East Asia. And I see revisionist powers over there. I see one in Russia. I see another in Iran. Maybe you may disagree. And then I see China in East Asia. Unfortunately, those theaters are not mutually independent anymore. I mean, given the speed and volume, quality of the movement of goods and services and information that really connect those theaters together. So I like to share with you what I have in mind for the policy Japan should have vis-a-vis the Eurasian continent. First of all, basically what we need to do is to prevent any hegemonic power dominating in each of those theaters. Second, prevent also at the same time the cooperation among those revisionist powers and dominating on the Eurasian continent. It is pretty simple to say that the Middle East is so important to us because it is the main source of energy for Japan. And of course, that Japan and the Middle East have been connected by the sea lines of communication throughout in the Indian Ocean and East and South China Seas. So we need that. We need stability over there, and we don't want any power to disrupt the stability over there. That would be detrimental to the security of Japan. That's number one. Number two, East Asia. And we are not interested in the continent anymore. We are interested in the sea lines of communication, as I said. So the question is that some revisionist powers might try to dominate the water areas, which is vital to Japan's security, especially those sea lines of communication throughout in the south. That's number two. And number three, Europe. Why? This is one of the areas that we haven't paid enough attention so far. But we need Russians to be controlled in the European theater. And we want more powerful, healthy Europe for two reasons. To counterbalance the Russians in the theater, and also strong, powerful Europe guarantees stable Middle East. And also, the Europeans don't get it, but we have Chinese and Russians as neighbors. Europeans only have Russians as neighbors. So that's the fundamental strategic difference between the European concept of strategy and the Japanese one. So, what are you going to do next? We have North Korea, fine, but well, I wouldn't underestimate the importance, but it's an episode. From the strategic point of view, it's an episode. China is much, much more important as a revisionist power. And India is not a theater. India is not a revisionist power. India is a status quo power, or indifferent, I would say, because India is a subcontinent. It's independent and maybe non-aligned. So, of course, the India-Japan cooperation is important and should be pursued, but there's a limit because they don't think that way. We are a maritime nation, and we want a status quo on the huge continent in front of us. But India is a little bit more independent part of it. The United States, Israel, United Kingdom, and maybe some other countries share similar values and strategic interests. They are the stability of the each theater and the Eurasian continent, as well as the security or stability in the sea lines of communication.
Thank you. I guess Ken will have probably a few words to say a little bit more specific about Japan, how Japan sees it in terms of this Eurasia concept as a whole, but then also I think you probably have additional comments to say about how Southeast Asia plays in the Japan's landscape.
Okay, thank you, it's my pleasure. In my initial remark, I would like to offer my view how Japanese diplomacy have perceived the concept of the Eurasia. And I'd like to point out the three benchmark years, that is 1997, 2007, and 2017. That is 20 years, 10 years in a row. I think it's the first time for Japanese diplomacy, which officially labeled the Eurasia diplomacy, was when Prime Minister Hashimoto was there. And he actually created the concept of the Japan's Eurasia diplomacy with considerable backgrounds were behind. 1996 was the timing that we had a Taiwan Strait crisis with a Chinese missile test over the Taiwan Strait during the election. And April, we had a first U.S.-Japan joint declaration, that's Hashimoto-Clinton, that is to demonstrate, and he was in charge of during those days. But that was a very important benchmark for how U.S.-Japan alliance should be reconfigured to adapt to the post-Cold War environment. But I think at the same time that we perceive the rise of China as I think a structural kind of challenge that we have in the long term that requires Japan to diversify our own strategy directly towards China, but also in relations to outreach our diplomatic posture to other regions. And one of the emphasis that the Prime Minister Hashimoto made was his diplomacy to Russia, and that still lingers. Hashimoto standards to be applied to our negotiation with Russia. So his own concept was bringing Russia in as a major player in Asia. So we have been quite instrumental bringing Russia into the APEC in 1998, and that was quite important. And second is Japan's indigenous approach to China, and in terms of energy and environment, it was Prime Minister Hashimoto who actually had the joint communique with them, and that was a very forward-looking, and our diplomacy still, I think, refers to those days of Hashimoto, who created the baselines of the broader cooperation with China. And the third was the active engagement in so-called Silk Road region. So actually, Japan has a copyright of the Silk Road diplomacy, and that was back in 1990s, and especially those concepts were instrumental in engaging the former CIS countries, Central Asia, and also the Caucasus, in terms of the broadening our economic aid engagement in that in those eras. So that was 1997. And 2007, and that was the first Abe administration with the concept of so-called the arc of freedom, prosperity, and value-driven diplomacy. And that concept was quite unique, and I think during those days that Prime Minister Abe and also the Foreign Minister Aso were trying to kind of revise the long-standing pillar of the Japanese diplomacy. Tried to collaborate with the Western powers, center on the U.S.-Japan alliance, our relation with Asia, and also UN Center of Diplomacy that was established in 1957. And half century later, that the administration tried to revise to incorporate that value-driven diplomacy to broaden our scope of engagement through the emphasis of the universal values like democracy, freedom, human rights, and rule of law. And then we do have the vast scope of geographical coverage from the Baltic states, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Caucasus, and Middle East, South and Southeast Asia. But as you can see, that this concept didn't really last long because of the political fluctuation that we have in those eras. And the successor, Prime Minister Fukuda, didn't like that concept because of his own conviction to engage more with China and also with Korea. And obviously those concepts were notorious among our neighboring countries. And then back in 2017, we have a very similar foreign policy team of 2006 and 2007 at the first Abe administration, but we didn't really revive that concept as it is. But instead, we call it foreign policy that had the panoramic view of the world, which is a very vague one. But with that concept and with the extraordinary state of the political stability we had of the Abe administration, and he has already had 54 foreign travels that covers 64 5 countries, which is an unprecedented level of engagement that the one prime minister have done during his tenure. And why we call it 2017 so important, that is closely related with what Kuni has mentioned. It is more accidental because now United States back away from the many of the international commitment like Paris Accord, TPP, couple of multilateral engagement. If you go to G7, it was Prime Minister Abe and Chancellor Merkel who has actually had been long-standing kind of figure to maintain the liberal order and the coalition among the advanced the economy. So Japanese government point of view, there has been a more sense of responsibility, like a shared responsibility to lead those kind of liberal institutional order in the region. At the same time, why 2016-17? Because another reason is Russia. We do have our own kind of preferences and try to seize the opportunity, strategic opportunity, how this new kind of Russia-Japan entente can create the status of like a diversified or strategic portfolio in this region. And that obviously that the main target is China, but we are not naive that we would not try to use that Russia-Japan cooperation as a balancing effect on China, but at least that we are aiming at diversify the Chinese strategic calculus when they face with Japan, and that Russian factor can become a very important tool for us. So these are something that has been evolved in the Japanese perspective on how we see the Eurasian policy.
Thank you. I guess listening to all 4 of you, it looks like U.S. and Japan shares 2 key interests in this region, and one, I think all of you have said in different forms, which is to prevent the rise of hegemonic powers in this region, either in the region as a whole or in the subset of this region. And the other is the prevent the cooperation amongst the emerging or rising or revisionist powers in this area. And now, as Ken mentioned, there is a perception overall outside the U.S. that with the new administration in place, Americans are in kind of a withdrawal stage of from those global engagements, and that brings the question of whether with U.S. or without the U.S., the cooperation amongst the status quo power, and then I think that's where India probably would definitely come in. And Japan is the status quo power, and Europe as a bloc, whether it's NATO or EU, is another one. If you can just parse out or think out loud of course, if U.S. is in the game, that's a force multiplier, but maybe U.S. may not always be the prime movers of this stabilizing effort. But given that premise, how would you say the U.S. course of action in terms of the cooperation with the status quo power that's either within the Eurasia or slightly outside Eurasia and more have an independent feel like India? And I will probably start you from Samir on that.
Okay, I'm not going to be very helpful because I'm going to try to bust up this status quo revisionist dichotomy that we're employing. Because it's used a lot, actually, in this town, frankly, and even in IR theory. But there's not, I think, there's not a shared understanding of what it means to be a revisionist power. So let's try to break it down. Revisionist power means you're somehow revising something about the status quo, but that could be territory. It could be about regimes like around you. It could be about the way the international system works. It could be about particular international institutions, and it could be about just recognition of positional status. And I would submit that I think revisionism is, frankly, in the eye of the beholder. So I'll give you some examples. India thinks that Pakistan is a revisionist state, has thought so for the last 70 years. But it doesn't, and it now is starting to believe that China is a revisionist state. But it would disagree about sort of whether Iran or Russia are revisionist states. They have very different, and I'm talking about sort of, my belief is that this is how the Ministry of External Affairs in India would sort of think about this. I think Saudi Arabia would think that Iran is the chief revisionist state in the region, and maybe even globally. But they might, And maybe they would think about that for Russia, but they probably wouldn't necessarily agree on China. Lots of countries around the world think that we're a revisionist state. We actually did this because we had a very distinct plan about revising the map and the nature of regimes and governance within the Middle East, and we acted upon it, and we did, at least overthrew 2 states and probably destabilized a number of others. So that's revisionism. And Pakistan has always thought that India is a revisionist state because India's aspirations are for it to dehyphenate from Pakistan, from the South Asia boundaries, and rise to a great power status, at least in sort of global recognition. And that comes with being treated as a nuclear weapons state, joining the nuclear suppliers group, getting a seat on the UN Security Council, and all these things. We look to India and we say, this is great, they're a status quo power. Well, a lot of observers around, a lot of states would see that as actually them trying to break out of the status quo for various reasons. So what I think we're really describing is sort of some sort of shift where we have latent power being translated into real power, and then an expectation that that state wants to convert that into some sort of de jure recognition, at least some recognition from other states that they are now a more serious player. And I think if we see that in those terms, then we just recognize that it's going to be natural for states to be moving sort of up and down. There's going to be ascendance. But that's not necessarily the same, and ascendance is inevitable, and decline is inevitable, but that's not necessarily the same as being a hegemon, or being the hegemon. And I think if we sort of acknowledge that there's going to be China is rising, there's no way to deny that, and commensurate with its rise, it's going to have influence in a way much greater than it did in the past, and it's going to expect that institutionally be recognized, and that other great powers recognize it as such. Iran is the same way, at least in the regional context, and Russia feels that it was diminished after the Cold War in much greater than it should have been, considering it has still a great deal of latent power in terms of industrial capacity, technology, very large population, geography, and tremendous military power. It's still sort of the second strongest military in the world. And so for all those reasons, it thought that its positional status and institutional status was degraded far beyond its actual capabilities, and so it wants to be treated and exert influence in a way that is treated as a great power. So I think we can accept that those are going to happen, and we want to manage sort of the negative externalities and consequences of that for our interests. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a hegemon. I think we can agree that we want to prevent a true hegemon, which is total dominance of industrial Eurasia, without necessarily trying to counteract the ascendance that is inevitable with a lot of different states.
With that provocative answer, I think Ellen had a counter-argument.
So I want to connect Samir's very useful, I think, shaking up of our concepts here to this other sort of existential debate we're having about whether the liberal international order is in decline or not. That might be another prism through which we can decide who's revisionist and who's hegemon, who's the status quo and who's revisionist. So here you have Europe, the United States, and probably Japan still believing that there are some shared values and institutional purpose to the Western imposed liberal international order of post-World War II. And lots of other countries are questioning it. Does it mean they're revisionist powers? I appreciate you saying, it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder, and that even within a country, regimes and leaders change, and so at various times they sound more ambitious and more like they have the aspiration to change the rules than others. So countries, alternate, as we do, between leaders that have, big ideas for their role in the world, and then leaders that may take a more modest, incremental approach. So, but I do think it is useful to remind ourselves which are the countries that still are defending a concept called, the liberal international order, and which are the countries who really do think that it's useful to rewrite the rules once a century, okay? Guess what? We are in a stage of some rewriting of the rules. If you see Russia and China working together at the UN Security Council to prevent interventions in defense of, responsibility to protect, genocide prevention, et cetera, when you have two very large veto-wielding countries no longer believing that it's the responsibility of the UN to prevent certain certain terrible things from happening within sovereign state borders, then you're starting to shift the rules. And so far we have not seen the status quo defenders of the liberal order be able to successfully push back entirely. So I think we have to be careful of being overconfident that we know what box to put Russia and or China in. That sometimes we think that, and this is a game that the U.S. played in the 70s of trying to pit them against each other, when in fact, from time to time, they will have tactical or more than tactical convergence of interests. So I did appreciate Kuni mentioning that if we think of Russia, China, Iran as three countries that, however you want to say it, are they trying to rewrite the rules? Do they believe that there's an alternative world order? When it comes to the Middle East, if those three countries are pushing back against what they see as a U.S. Sunni Israel alliance, then we have a genuine geopolitical clash. I think the U.S. is, on the one hand, we're sounding like we know what we're talking about a Sunni alliance, and then a little dispute like Qatar pops up, and then turns out that we're working kind of at cross purposes with our own ideas. But the larger point is whether the useful division is it time to rewrite the rules for international cooperation, and are these Asian powers, and poor Japan is stuck sort of, in a way, defending the older order, if you will, but are there powerful forces in Asia that are saying it really is time to rewrite the rules? And is there any rewriting of those rules that could be, over time, compatible with American interests? So I mentioned before our session began that I thought it was a nice little factoid for this conversation that India and Pakistan both joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization this week, I guess. I don't know how much they pushed for it or whether the Chinese were inviting, they decided to expand the membership, et cetera. But, when we've talked about Europe historically, we've been confident that we know that the transatlantic institutions, particularly NATO, somehow have some enduring value and serve stability. Well, we've had, lots of volatile debates about the long-term utility of NATO. Is there an Asian parallel institutional structure emerging that we should worry about? For now, I think those Asian institutions are still, relatively young and weak, and they haven't gotten bogged down in process yet because they haven't created enough process internally to manage their institutional goals. But I would welcome how Kuni and Ken see the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and this question of whether Asia really does want to, is there some collective impulse in Asia to rewrite the rules for international cooperation?
I think that's a great segue to go over to that side of the podium. Do you want to start, Ken?
Sure. I think that the notion of defending the international liberal norms versus the emerging CounterHopes is a very interesting benchmark to decipher the current dynamics. One of the reasons why the 2007 value-driven diplomacy concept did not fly well enough is exactly because that it doesn't really capture the trends of the, whether revisionist or the counter norms, whatever you call it, has been emerging, especially since then. And I'm a fan of general democracy debates, and everybody talks about the decline of democracy. That actually happened in 2006 and 7. And if you actually try to follow the modernization debate, that then economic growth and political liberalization will proceed in tandem. That was true up until 2006, and that was a peak of it. And 61% of the world actually achieved the electoral democracy. And since then, since 2006 and 2016, along with those 10 years, the world GDP has expanded like a 2.4 times bigger. But the political liberalization does not really follow on that. So it's levelized in 60%, which means that the emerging economies are actually emerging without going through the political reform. And that, if that is a reality, how we can really engage to those economies with that, like IMF type of very strict kind of conditionality rules will still make a difference to invest in many of those countries. Or those AIIB type of new scheme can have more effective tool to engage in the new economy? I think the answer would be quite obvious. So this is the kind of practical reality that we also need to relook about how the institution has to be adapt to the new reality. And we can go back to 2005 when we failed in the IMF reform, and that was huge. And I think the very slow progress of the ADP to collaborate with AIIB process, and that is also the huge agenda that we have to identify. And Alan mentioned about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There have been, I think, the impulse of Chinese diplomacy that they really want to create its own version of institutionalization and regional mechanisms, looking to the West. And with successful case, they want to refer those mechanisms to be reflected back in Asia-Pacific region. That was a very interesting way. So that they refer to CIGS, back in a couple of years ago that President Xi Jinping talked about the Asian system should be created by Asians. And then now it's a Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Silk Road projects, AIIB, BRICS banks, to provide those kind of new security and investment schemes that can also have its own reference to be back in Asia-Pacific region. So that I think that's a very important way that how we can maintain the relevance by, we really need to increase our robustness. And that question comes, for example, that whether United States and Japan should join in the AIIB. And I think that this question is still valid, but my personal kind of take is that we don't really have to follow, immediately now, but we really want to keep our robustness. If we try to alter the process from the AIIB investment scheme, that our version of the investment has to be equally robust in that region. So this is the kind of competition that has to be going on. And if we want to have its own good division of labor in between what we call the high quality investment scheme versus kind of more convenient way of investment scheme, but we really need to have our own presence and physical presence and financial presence in the region in order to achieve those two schemes to be converged.
Either Kuni or Samir has any reaction to what just
well,
has been said?
I'm not a scholar, and I'm not interested in academic definitions. What I'm interested in is the real pragmatic interest of Japan, as in the case of the United States. Any other country should be the same. I think as far as Japan's real no baloney sort of interest, we are a maritime nation without resources, and we have to live on trade. And we have to add values to the raw materials. So that's the only way we can survive. That's why we don't, it's not because international liberal order sounds beautiful. No, because that really helps Japan's interest. That's why we believe in the liberal international order. And we cannot live in a Sinocentric sort of a world order which used to exist maybe 2,000 years ago, or maybe until a few hundred years ago. That will not help us. That's the reason why I believe in liberal international order. And also I'd like to mention something about Shanghai Cooperation, whatever. It's a collection of various elements. And I don't see any common values or common objectives among those nations. So, fine to have one entity and have as many countries join, but it doesn't mean that it will have a specific sort of momentum in the long run. Finally, I'd like to mention, as I said last time I was here, for me, the Middle East and East Asia are becoming one. So I call it the Middle East Asia. Middle East Asia concept is at least two theaters of operation. It's becoming one. They are connected on the sea with the operation of the Seventh Fleet, headquartered, home ported in Yokosuka. And the Fifth Fleet will take care of the inside the Gulf. But also, you have to have another sort of perspective. That is the Xinjiang, Uyghur, Central Asia, Islam sort of linkage. That's also becoming one. And as you know, the ISIS is leaving the Middle East, and they're coming to the Philippines, and they're coming to Southeast Asia. So this is the reality I'm talking about, and that's why it's time to call the one theater of operation that I call Middle East Asia.
Sure. Yeah, I thought Ellen made a really good point about sort of this idea that there are certain states that sort of adhere to the liberal international order or sort of want to sort of maintain it, and others that might be challenging it. But I'm not sure the challenges are coming at every direction, because I think about the liberal international order. I mean, I think the two core components are about sovereignty and about territorial integrity. And I think a lot of states, even the ones we sort of think of as revisionists, actually believe in sovereignty and territorial integrity to a degree. There are certainly subversive activities that I'd say all great powers engage in, which then kind of counteract sovereignty in various ways. And the United States is one of them, but Russia clearly is one of them as well. When it comes to things like international trading system, I think it's another one where there are a lot of countries that have a stake in it. I don't think Japan, and just because maritime powers sort of are engaged in it, they're the only ones that sort of believe in the international system of trade. China clearly depends on it, not just in terms of sort of goods and services, but also in financial networks, et cetera. So clearly there are other adherents to the international trading system, but the way it's under threat is actually not from states challenging it, but from within. I mean, this is what we're finding out, is that there's a lot of domestic pushback across a large parts of the adherents to the liberal order, where there's people who believe, large populations that believe that they have been victims of trade rather than sort of beneficiaries of it. And so I don't think that it's under assault, again, from revisionist powers. I think it's under assault from maybe problems of sort of distribution that are sort of causing a lot of questioning internally. And in terms of liberal values, I mean, I think we overestimate how much this was actually sort of spreading and enduring sort of within the international system. I think we agreed on sort of capitalism and trade and openness of the seas. But in terms of the values, I think that was always a very sort of tenuous assumption that sort of we bought into for a while. And even the functioning of the international institutions, they rarely worked. Even during the Cold War, they rarely worked. On very few occasions did you actually have consensus amongst the five great powers. But it did work on a few occasions. I think the most recent one was on Iran sanctions, which you got all five powers to agree on pretty rigorous sanctions that then sort of created an outcome that was probably net beneficial for the global community. So they're probably not going to work in a lot of instances when it comes to sort of humanitarian intervention operations, but they have worked in some sort of the extreme cases that are sort of maybe of most importance to the global community. I do agree, though, that you're right, that there is this challenge that might be manifesting when it comes to freedom of the seas, right? So freedom of navigation. That is sort of central to the functioning of the global economy, but also for U.S. projection power, although we have the ability to ensure it on our own, at least for now, because of our sort of dominance of the commons and our ability to leverage the commons. So I don't think it's under threat now, but it has the potential to be, especially with more assertive claims about territorial waters, and that's something that we need to sort of collectively push back on. But again, I think that you'll find that that it's not just that there's a Russia, China, Iran bloc opposing that. I imagine we could find sort of other partners who would be supportive of that. And frankly, the United States could do a better job of backing it by ratifying UNCLOS. That's sort of been a huge obstacle for our ability to persuade others to sort of get on board with these definitions. So I'll leave it at that.
What Samir just mentioned about the challenge to the order, the international liberal order, maybe from within, I think we're seeing in this country the manifestation of it in a certain way that we have a now president who constantly talks about America first as an organizing principle of all the major policy decisions that he's making. And if we're doing it here, how can we blame? There is certainly an argument that can be made that, you know, how can we the only one who are allowed to say that? And then when everybody else says that, that's somehow revisionist to the revisioning to the international order. You know, some could say that it's a healthy dose of hypocrisy going on, or double standard at least going on. But this has been really fascinating. I can do this for another half an hour, but I think I would probably go ahead and open up the floor to the question. If you can raise your hand, identify yourself. There will be a microphone that'll get to you, so please do identify yourself. And please pose a question in the form of question. And if you want to direct it to any four of them specifically, feel free to do so. If it's to any one of the four, if you want to listen to all four perspective of it, please say that as well. So with that, David.
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired foreign service. I have a question about the, maybe directed more towards Miyabe-san, about whether or not Japan can live in a Sino-centric order. It seems to me that a lot of the discussion in recent years about the rise of Eurasia really coincides with the rise of China as a truly global, second highest economic power, and really coming out with some institutions that challenge the existing institutions in some ways. So it's really a question of how much the U.S. and Japan and Europe can accommodate to China. And you get into questions of the values in Europe, U.S. and Japan versus those in China. And we can forget about Russia and Iran and all those other Central Asian countries in terms of wondering about how the U.S. and Japan can deal with Eurasia. We can just get China right. It'll probably last at least until 2027 when Jimbo-san will come back.
It's a big, difficult question to answer. You know, I lived in the Middle East, and now I know a little bit about the tradition of monotheistic thinking. And having lived in the Middle East for more than several years, then I got posted in Beijing. And I hope I'm not going to offend anybody, but in the Middle East, God created human beings. But in China, human beings create gods. So there's no rule of God. There's no absolute rule of sort of a hierarchy, you know. And all men are created equal under God. But in China, there's no space for God Almighty. Everything is political because everything is relative, because human beings are superior to the divine entity. So that's why it's so difficult, to be honest with you. It took Japan more than 100 years to get used to that monotheistic thinking. And we are not a monotheistic power yet. It won't be. But we know how to deal with it. But it will take China maybe not years, decades, or maybe centuries. And they may not accept that kind of thinking. The liberal international order is similar to that of the relationship between God and human beings. Every single nation is created equal. No matter how small it is, or how big it is, it's just a sovereign nation. But it's not going to happen in a Sinocentric world order.
Ken, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, when you look at the style of the leadership between U.S. and China, and according to those power transition theory, China is replacing especially in the influence, especially in the Eurasian continents. But I think one of the big differences between U.S. and China is whether China can provide the so-called public goods to those regions. Security guarantee, economic platforms, and also rule-based order. And that is widely lacking. Although that in terms of the trade volumes, for example, in India, that's really dominating, and it's increasing. Japan's role, the presence in India has not been in a good shape. We are targeting more, but it's not been way behind that we are, trying to target at. So that physical presence is very much on the spot. But in terms of the credibility of how the China plays role in this region has been questioned. So that creates those countries' alternative hedging strategy, other than China. Look at Myanmar. They've been quite, exposed to the Chinese influence. But in a couple of years back, they really turned around to pursue more like a multifaceted international engagement. And you can find a very similar pattern of how to receive the Chinese influence everywhere in the region. And this is where I think that the U.S. Japan can come in as, I think that the accepting their demands of need for the hedging strategy towards China. We are no longer the major player in the Central Asia, Caucasus, in many places, but there are appetite for actually trying to diversify the strategy other than China or other than Russia. And these are, I think, high demand that we need to explore and penetrate into that.
Rusty?
Hi, Russ Deming, this is for Kuni and Jimbo-san. Drilling down a little bit on China's sort of Eurasian strategy, if you look at the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is really concrete, putting resource into expanding the infrastructure of communications and transportation between Asia and Europe and indeed Africa, is that necessarily inimical to the interests of the U.S. and Japan? Should we be concerned about that? Or is that something that is neutral at worst and perhaps positive in terms of developing greater communication between the regions?
Itailu is a slogan. Nothing more than that. They started talking about it. It's a policy of Mr. Xi Jinping. So, but what they're doing is, at least on the waters, probably they'll be easier because there are not many barriers. It's on the waters, but on the ground, it's completely different. You know that you go all the way to Europe, you have to penetrate the landmass of Islam, which starts from Xinjiang, Uyghur area. It's not the start is not the Central Asia. And there are 5 Stan nations bordering with China in the western part of China, and they cannot even control the Xinjiang province. And they don't know how to deal with the Muslims. I think I know a little bit more than the Chinese do. And it's not easy, and especially those who drink and eat pork. How could they reconcile with the world of Islam? I visited the Uyghur area, Urumqi, and I was so shocked. It's already it was a Central Asian region, And now, 10 years later, I revisited the city, and it's becoming more and more Chinese or Hanized area. And it's scary, because those Muslims are kicked out of the city. Are they happy? Of course not. They can't even control the Muslim population inside China. How could they deal with the other Muslims in Central Asia on its route to the European continent? So I'm very skeptical.
Well, I think in terms of the One Belt, One Road initiative, that is a massive concept that covers 56 countries in the Eurasian continents, and we always have a risk of too much of the generalization of the success and failure of the prospect of the OBR. But given that the huge infrastructure potential demand of that region, I think China is rationally doing the right things to apply those demands with the massive investment schemes through Silk Road funds and AIIB, and those are, I think, the way that we should not be too hostile about it. But in the detail, there's a lot of concerns. The financing schemes, transparency, labor rights, environments, and those are always there about jeopardizing the quality of investment. Like what happened in Indonesia high-speed rail case, it is not a fair competition at all. If those kind of standards to be applied to other infrastructure scheme, that will ruin and jeopardize many of those trade and investment relationship for in the mid and longer term in the Eurasian continents. But still, that we have we need to seek the way to collaborate through connecting the role played by the ADB, IMF, and also the AIB into that schemes. But what I concern more is the maritime part of the Silk Road projects. Obviously, it is not solely the commercial projects, but also has its own military perspective towards it. When you look at their own engagement in the Andaman Sea, Sri Lanka, Djibouti, those areas, those investment schemes seems to be initially it's a commercial base, but way they construct and design the places is the platform for the future military engagement. So I think that we really need to call upon China about its own strategic intent and transparency over those, especially the maritime infrastructure project they are going to scheme. And I think that making them to be more transparent and open to the foreign investments and clear up those, the intention may be very important to, look at those projects.
Samir had
Yeah, as I was listening to some of the responses, it made me realize that, there's also opportunity here. This is one of the things I think that, like, defenders of the liberal order, liberal internationalist order, tend to sort of not have sufficient faith in its durability, and the reason why it sort of has succeeded for so long is because it's actually a very competitive system. So if we're talking about a China that's going to be expanding into new regions without providing public goods or operating under sort of a certain rule of law that's predictable and accepted by local populations, by engaging in extractive and exploitative development without sort of with limited local benefits, trying to demand political and or cultural subservience in the process, then they're basically, the methods of expansion are creating conditions for inherent resistance and opposition, and that's why we're seeing some of these turns from Myanmar. There's always been hostility with Vietnam, but it's a clear opportunity for other actors to collaborate with Vietnam to sort of push back on China, both militarily but also economically. You saw a shift in 2015 in Sri Lanka that was pretty remarkable. The Chinese did not predict. they were totally caught off guard, which was an electoral change, which was largely built on the backs of opposition to China's investment strategies that were kind of like soaked in the corrupt regime in Sri Lanka. And it doesn't mean that China's influence is gone, but it's definitely much more rebalanced compared to what it was then. And India became much more assertive. And I think the United States has sort of built some stronger relations back into Sri Lanka as well. And I think we'll see this play out in Pakistan. I think it'll be a really interesting litmus test. And this is like sort of area I've been paying most attention to, because the flagship project of OBOR, or the BRI, is this China-Pakistan economic corridor. And in that case, it's very interesting. You're seeing serious investment coming from the Chinese side. You're also seeing some very curious aspects to it. So there was a news report that came out maybe a couple months ago in Dawn that was basically a leaked report about the long-term plan of China in Pakistan. So it was beyond sort of the energy and investment, infrastructure investment. And it was talking about sort of other areas that China is going to sort of try to engage with Pakistan for the economic benefits. So, and part of this is obviously sort of China's overcapacity problems, trying to sort of move some of its production capacity into other countries. They're pretty open about this. They say this is sort of a way to sort of sustain these industries, or sort of at least transition for a more softer landing. But this the long-term plan talked about a few other things, including engagement in Pakistan's agriculture sector. So the idea was that China would start to move into sort of the agribusiness, substitute technology for labor in Pakistan, because it's a very inefficient system in Pakistan. This has been sort of the case for decades. And get engaged in sort of high-end technology on sort of seeds and genetic modifications and things like that. And this project, I mean, it seems nice, like sort of on paper. It actually seems like sort of very technologically sort of innovative. But when the rubber meets the road, you're going to encounter a Pakistani society that is largely agriculture and peasant-based, where landlord-peasant relations are the basis for political power of most of Pakistan's elites, where these rural areas also sort of deeply intertwined with local militant organizations. I'm not saying militants in the sense of sort of international ones, but just in terms of sort of local militias, which are sort of like part of like landlord feudal relations. So they're basically walking, or at least sort of projecting to walk into what seems like a hornet's nest, and then try to rewire the circuits of society in a way that's much more invasive than anything the United States tried in Iraq or Afghanistan, because this is social building at the core level, social engineering. And I think if that's the ambition, let's see how it plays out. I think they will encounter tremendous resistance in this process. And if this is sort of projected into other areas, I think they'll meet the same. And that provides opportunities for both the United States and Japan and other partners.
And just quickly, another example of that is the work our colleagues at Stimson do on Southeast Asia about the dams, where China has had to pull back a little bit because of anticipation of local unrest, or really that they'd be creating so much turbulence that their own investment would be at risk. So that maybe slowly they will find that the existing rules have some virtue to them, and that wouldn't it be interesting if these so-called revisionist powers end up deciding that over time they have to adapt to, that there's a logic to the rules about trade and sovereignty, and what the boundaries are of when you intervene in another country and when you don't. So it's a good point.
How do you evaluate the power of the key currency?
You identify yourself very quickly.
I'm Tetsuro Hisano from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries America. So how do you evaluate the power of the key currency, or the influence of the key currency? So after the World War II, Japan and also the Western Europe enjoyed the prosperity getting the help from the United States, the Marshall Plan. But at the same time, we enjoy the very nice capitalism under the key currency of the dollar, US dollars. But when we think about the future, if the US dollar will be the key currency, maybe the usual people just be attracted by the currency. So not by value, not by religion. For example, the underdeveloping countries are very much welcome the investment, the money. So in this case, the currencies power is very important. So how do you evaluate the future of the key currency or the power of the currency that affects the world order?
I'm nervous that you think I might have an answer to that question, because I don't.
I'm nervous too.
This is an open question for everybody.
I don't know whether over time, as we really think out the 21st century, that whole competition of currencies is actually going to mutate into something different, where between Bitcoin and, the way people can use alternative can do financial transactions that are somehow a little bit divorced from national currencies. That's just I'm throwing out sort of a big idea that over time it may be less important. But I'm not a financial analyst, so I would leave to or monetary, so I would leave to others to offer their expertise.
Wait.
So then Kuni,
Yeah.
take it.
I do not know the future of U.S. dollars as a key currency, but I can think of other currencies. Yuan won't be a key currency because of all the restrictions, regulations, and it's being tightened and tightened. It's getting worse and worse, so I don't think it will be. It will be used more in more countries, but doesn't mean that it's going to be a key currency. Yen, probably not. Euro, there's no chance. And ruble, never. That means it's only one choice. That's the United States dollar will continue to be a key currency. That's my prediction.
I'm not going to bet, but I do recall this discussion was happening a lot in like 2006 and 2007. And a key mover of this was the Saudis, because how you denominated oil, whether in dollars and I think the discussion then was about the euro, and that doesn't seem as competitive, right? Even then, and so now it seems less probable. So I think that would at least be a bellwether. But I think you're probably right. There's not really a clear competitor right now.
I think, Abigail, and then gentleman next.
Abigail Friedman with the Wisteria Group. Thank you very much. We've been talking a lot about sort of the nation-state perspective on Eurasia and where everyone fits in. Samir did mention the populations. My question is, we may be seeing in many situations where the U.S. is failing. Regions, Afghanistan is a good example. And China is also failing in Afghanistan. You mentioned the limitations with Pakistan. So my question is, what is happening with non-state actors? Will they be filling the void? Is this something we have to factor in when we talk about the different position of the players vis-a-vis Eurasia?
I think I would probably, if I have to pick, I would ask Ellen to kind of start off and then ask everyone else to react. Maybe.
Well, Abby, I'm glad you mentioned, I think it's absolutely a profound trend of the 21st century that citizens across boundaries can organize, even within boundaries, but certainly across boundaries, and that this whole shift of, as states become less controlling, the sort of balancing act is that empowered citizens can actually get a lot done without necessarily reference to their state or their national level government. So I think in the West it's a more advanced concept than it is in Asia so far, but I expect it will continue to become it's one of the globalization effects, that people can communicate and they can even make decisions collectively, and they can do all kinds of, and some of this is a very positive trend. And then of course we have terrorism and criminal networks and the bad actors that can use the same mobilization tools. But I do think that Asia is a little bit in denial that states are weaker. I think in the West there is a sort of reluctant recognition that states don't control all of human activity that happens within their geographic space. And, you know, certainly the way American society is reacting to our withdrawal from the Paris Agreement is, you know, we don't care, we're going to do it anyway because we think we have to, you know, it's the right thing to do. So I do think it's an important trend to recognize, and I wonder whether in Japan, whether there's a similar view that power is diffusing, and that even though people live in sovereign states that give them certain protections and responsibilities and rights, in fact, people can function a little bit more independent of their states, and that how do you harness that energy and how do you channel it to achieve, you know, policy goals? Maybe that gets harder to do because you don't have, people are not working as much within formal structures and institutions. But anyway, it's a big topic because I think we can also talk about the decline of legitimacy of governance in many forms. But I don't know in Japan of whether you would see also the rise of non-state actors as a net positive, or is it seen as something that erodes the power of the state in bad ways?
Well, I don't know what you mean by non-state actors, but in my mind, they are terrorists. Okay? So if that's the case, there is no independent sort of element as non-state actors as per se, because to me, those non-state actors are a result of the failed state. Okay, and of course, we are not in the era of the traditional sort of nation-state sort of competition, but still, even if the economies can be globalized, but the human minds cannot be easily globalized as economies are. So still the nation-state concept is valid, but if they fail, if they become failed states, it's a sanctuary for those actors. So I think the element of non-state actors are important, but they are not the reason, they are the result.
Yeah, one of the huge kind of societal differences that you can find between those Western nations vis-a-vis Eurasian continent is the population dynamics. We are the aging society, and they are having a youth bulge, and there's a lot of like youth powers inside it, and that creates a lot of like prospects and also the concerns in terms of the production powers. If the nation adopts a clear strategy that has a huge potential that they can produce more. At the same time that if the governance failed in terms of the legitimacy of the governance are not being there, that can become a huge elements of concern that it was witnessed by the Springs of Arab in many states. And in terms of that, I think Japan is also having its own approach, especially by utilizing so-called our soft power to spread the pro-Japanese in those regions. Luckily, there are so many, pro-Japanese everywhere in the world. So I think spreading out those our own soft power assets to those regions have been well understood when we try to engage in those regions. And taking advantage of the case on like a 2020 Olympics, and that also is a great occasion that we reach out through utilizing those powers in this region. Beyond that, I don't really have a conceptualized approach to that.
Well, I have lots to say on this. I think there's always been, I think there's always been a gulf between the Weberian state and the Westphalian state. And so I think we've noticed it maybe more in the last 15, 20 years, particularly because you see violent non-state actors, but there's always been a lack of control. And by that I mean states are defined by territorial boundaries. That's the Westphalian state. But the Weberian state is about sort of the administrative control that a state has and its ability to govern both through direct control and through the legitimate use of force. And there's countries like around the world, including the United States, that just have not had that same degree of control about micromanaging society in all parts equally. So the examples, I studied this a lot in South Asia, which is that for the longest time, India has never really had real control over the Northeast. It's sort of like treated as a backwater. And basically there's lots of sort of these like diffuse militant networks that sort of collude with government and then fight the state, but then tax state leadership and kind of do what they want to do. And they've been doing it for 70 years. And like the state has like marginally more control and has the ability to bring the hammer down when it wants. It doesn't have the ability, it doesn't have disciplinary power for those who read Foucault. Like it doesn't have the ability to sort of control like sort of production, and like productive means that it only has the ability to punish periodically. This is true of Pakistan and its northwest frontier provinces. And when Al-Qaeda shows up there, then we start paying attention. But we never really pay attention to this in lots of other parts of the world. In Mindanao in the Philippines, going for like 40, 50 years. And there are really great studies about sort of how in the United States this is true too. How much control did the state of Illinois or the government, the city of Chicago have over Chicago housing projects during the 80s and 90s? There's a very interesting sociological study that basically says that a lot of governance happened locally and internally, and there was collusion with sort of the police, and the police sort of had live and let live bargains for how things sort of operate there. But for the most part, services, public goods, law and order were all sort of maintained locally by gangs. So the idea that there's somehow the state is always going to have sort of administrative control over all parts of society and their territory, I think, is a fiction. And I think there is diffusion happening, maybe because there's some sort of shift in the balance of technology between the state and society. But I still think at the end of the day, the states are the most meaningful entities that we have. They still control the rules of the game, right? We still have agreements about sort of territorial integrity and sovereignty. They're still the only countries that sort of get these major loans from international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. They're the only ones that can sort of buy arms and like large platform arms. You're not selling, I mean, there's small arms that definitely sort of get to non-state actors, but no small actors are going to be buying sort of, major warplanes or tanks or things like that. So there's still control over that by the international system. And I still think at the end of the day, the state has the ability to bring the hammer down. So India may not have full control over its territory, but when it wants to, it can dominate any territory for a period of time.
Thanks for your patience.
Hi, my name's Connor Hirsch. I'm a recent graduate from American University. So as the U.S. continues to recede from Asia, Eurasia, Japan faces the prospect of being left alone as the real defender of the liberal order on the landmass. It was stated that India is sort of too independent. Non-alignment 2.0 sort of does carry a sway in Indian politics and in strategic vision. But India in many ways does have the potential to act as a counterbalance to Sino-centric ordering of Eurasia. What prospects are there for Japan to sort of draw India out of its shell and sort of give it the nudge that it needs to realize its potential and act as a great power as it has some potential to be?
There has been the prospect, especially under the current Abe administration, that bringing India into that the structure of what you have described. One is the potential counterbalancer to China, and second is the constructive player in the Asian regional architecture. But those two objectives are quite hard to achieve because the India itself is the multifaceted strategic player. Not only in Asia, but also they are looking at South Asia, Eurasian continents, and also towards the West. So that it is too naive to regard India as a single, directed nation. We want India to be, strategic partner with us, but India is probably defining themselves as very different types of the player in that region. In terms of the strategic approach to India, as I mentioned very briefly before, but I think on the economic side that we are way behind the target. And we are now the 11th ranking in terms of the trade. And investment is not as much as we expected. It's a structural reason towards it because we have our own international, investment strategy, especially that was structured in Southeast Asia, more like production network chains. But similar patterns of the investment cannot be automatically, placed in India as well. India is more like, divided kind of the structure of the industry. On the high end, there's IT industries are there, and the low end is a kind of own dynamics of the indigenous kind of production policy that may have a very difficult for the foreign companies to be get into. So we've been having a very difficult in strategizing how to engage India economically. But in terms of the project, we do have a lot of investment schemes, infrastructure redevelopment, including the high-speed rails between Mumbai and Ahmedabad. And we recently agreed upon the civil nuclear technology cooperation with India. They have a potential that the Japanese company will collaborate on the nuclear project as well. So there's a couple of potential schemes to be developed between two countries, but still it is too patchy to say it is a strategic cooperation. In terms of the security, we'll become the major members of the Malabar naval exercise. That's a good news. We also think about transferring of our defense equipment, including the multi-purpose aircraft like a U-2, US-2. U-2 is something very different. But given that the strategic importance and economic presence of the China is at place, what we are doing is the part of the hedging strategy for India. So I do not think that India can be the full-fledged kind of the player applying to your description. But I think that we will look at India in terms of the way we can actually have our own, hedging strategy and their own kind of diversification strategy in South Asia. They're a great partner, but they are not like take for granted partner in our, China strategy.
Samir, do you have a real quick reaction, or you're okay with that? I think this is fascinating. We unfortunately ran out of time, but I would like to thank four of you very much for a very interesting conversation. Nothing makes me more happy to have this kind of U.S.-Japan speakers that in the conversation that has not a single time come up Okinawa and Denmark and Hungary needs to get out, or the constitutional reform. So I'd like to thank all of you very much, and if you can join me thanking this wonderful panel.